Hey, good morning, everyone. I think we can get started. My name is Alfredo Villavicencio, and I'm the lead for the Clean Energy Learning Laboratory, led by the Climate Investment Fund's Evaluation Learning Unit, jointly with the Energy Unit. And this is where the virtual clinic on GHG emissions modeling takes place. Just a few reminders before we get started. Do note that we have interpretation to Spanish. Also, that this session is being recorded with the objective of us sharing it later with all participants and those who were not able to participate as well. We would appreciate if you could add next to your name either the country or the institution you're representing, so that it's easier for us to communicate with you during the questions and answers. And which is also another important point. We hope to make this a highly participatory couple of panel discussions that we have and presentations with around 15 to 20 minutes Q&A sessions. And with that, let me quickly go through the agenda that we have for today. We're very excited of being hosting Professor Wagner from Columbia Business School that will set us the stage on what's the cement industry doing in terms of decarbonization and some technology pathways. Then we will have the Asian Development Bank presenting through Darshak Mehta, Senior Carbon Capture and Utilization Specialist, a little bit of the projects that the ADB is doing in terms of decarbonizing the cement industry. Then we're going to go with the questions and answers led by our colleague Janak Shrestha, from Climate Change Specialist from the World Bank, who will be leading each of the Q&As that I'll be mentioning. Then we have the IFC presenting on the cement decarbonization tool. We have both Margarita Talavera, Senior Investment Officer and Lead for Construction Materials, and Claudine Morga, Senior Industry Specialist, particularly in the cement industry, that will be presenting that specific tool that we're very excited about. Then we have a Q&A, and then we go to the steel session, where we will be having the World Steel Association first speaking and setting up the stage in terms of the context for the industry, with Dr. Rizwan Hanhua, Head of Technology of World Steel Association. Then we will have the IFC presenting on some of the projects that they're taking forward in terms of decarbonizing the steel industry. And this is going to be Ashish Kumar, Steel Industrial Specialist. And then we're going to go for another Q&A. Then we will have the Asian Development Bank presenting on some of the GHG methodologies they've been using on projects that are decarbonizing the steel industry. And we'll have back again Darshak Mehta, Senior Carbon Capture and Utilization Specialist. And we'll finish that session and all both sessions with a Q&A for all of you. Having said that, let me go ahead and give it over to you, Professor Wagner. Over.
Thanks so much, and good morning from New York. I think I'm here for the appetizer, basically, before the real experts get to speak. Frankly, this slide could as easily say economics of decarbonizing steel as much as cement. So what I'd like to do is simply give you a high level overview. Beginning, for example, with the fact that, yes, what we are talking about here, sorry, there we go. Now this works. Okay. Is a big chunk of the problem, right? So the cement industry, 5 to 8% of global emissions. If this slide said steel, it would say somewhere between 8 and 12%, not counting fugitive methane from met coal and so on. And there's always more detail to add, of course. And yes, I could easily go into some of this detail now in, slides that frankly give a very high-level overview of where the problem is. Yes, in cement, it is clinker production that accounts for 85% of the emissions, and now we can pinpoint 3,600 or so cement kilns around the world, and basically start tackling this problem bottom up. But once again, just as a very quick reminder, here's why I think we are all here. this is a map of the world. It is temperatures. Actually, to put it differently, it's not temperatures. This is literally um, how much of the change in the temperatures, pixel by pixel, degree by degree, around the globe, is attributable to excess CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. Right? 10 years ago, it would have taken climate scientists months, years to pinpoint, attribute global average warming to any one to any one particular event, right? Massive storm, drought, and so on. Now we can do this. When I say we, climate scientists, can do this like the weather report. Right? This is how fast climate science has advanced. And yes, this has been around for a couple of years. And 2 years ago, the 5 on this scale was the extreme. This is from a couple days ago. Look how many 5s, how many dark reds there are on this map. Okay, so I'm not a climate scientist either, so I won't spend any more time on this, but we know what the problem is, and we kind of sort of also know the solution. And, don't blame the messenger, but it's always good to show a slide like this and not pointing to climate scientists, but to point to, for example, the Boston Consulting Group, in saying that, yes, here is what needs to happen in order to achieve certain climate goals. And full disclosure, former employee of said consultancy, myself. Again, right, this is not, oh, BCG says that, or McKinsey says that, but it is simply the reality check. Here's the flip side of that reality check. And this is a very US-centric view of the world, and you need to know a little bit about US politics to truly appreciate this graph. Blue is California, red is Texas. California came first and early, thanks to the other Austro-American you might have heard of. Schwarzenegger signed all the right laws into place when he was the governor of California in 2008, 2010 or so. And yeah, California has been doing the right thing for longer. And then in comes Texas, where solar PV deployment, by the way, took off during the first Trump administration term, 2016-ish. And it's been growing exponentially ever since. Not because of state level climate policies. Texas is no friend of climate policies, but because of the fundamental economics. And obviously, this is not cement decarbonization technologies. This is renewables and batteries, for that matter, to enable the decarbonization of electrification around the world. But of course, that is the point, that what we are talking about, for the most part, including for a cement and steel decarbonization, are technologies that will actually solve what we need to do. And technologies, by their very nature, can only get better and cheaper over time. Right? If this thing here, my fancy little phone, wouldn't get better year after year after year, we would stop spending however much these things cost these days, or the alternative is to make them cheaper over time. What we are up against are commodities, coal, oil, gas, and commodities by their very nature can only fluctuate. They're commodities. They're traded on the global market. And of course, cement and steel too are commodities. But if the techno fix is to look to technologies to decarbonize, well, again, the direction is clear. Those technologies can only go in one and one direction. Okay, I blamed BCG before. Let me blame McKinsey, or in this case, this is one of my classes. So when a senior partner of McKinsey shows up, he comes with a few slides, which then means I get to steal these slides and show them to others. Here is the McKinsey version of the world in how to look at these decarbonization technologies sector by sector technology by technology. And the one thing you might be looking for here that you won't be able to find is cement and steel, or cement and iron, for that matter. There's carbon removal. There are some other fundamental technologies that are important in decarbonizing steel. There's hydrogen, for example, listed here. What's also clear, of course, is that 90% of those technologies are out of the money at the moment. Yes, it takes policy. This flip, by the way, is not me. This is McKinsey itself as well, basically saying that, yes, with the right policies, proxied here by $100 per ton of CO2 price by the year 2030 globally. Newsflash, won't happen. But let's just assume that this is the kind of fundamental policy driver. Yes, back to my own take on things, there are now lots and lots of different policies that, when one dives into the details, will help deploy fundamental technologies that some are in fact in the money at the moment. And okay, a sector like cement, ruthless competition, of course, if it is cheaper to deploy, it'll happen quite automatically. And if it won't, it takes something else. It takes top-down policy, it takes bottom-up procurement policies, it takes lots and lots of other detailed policies to deploy these technologies to actually make a difference on the decarbonization front. Here is a different slice at the exact same data. One of these marginal abatement cost curves, for those who know what that means. Abatement potential on the x-axis, costs on the y-axis. And yes, there are some that right now, 2030 is on the left, 2050 on the right, already pay for themselves. Lots of uncertainties on how much they cost. Yes. Not a lot of uncertainty around certain kind of interventions, especially those under the heading of efficiency, basically substituting expensive inputs for cheaper, lower carbon ones, or for that matter, using less clinker in the first place, as one sort of simple techno fix, if you will, that runs up against trade-offs, of course, but still. Okay. 3 quick points in my last 3 minutes, if Alfredo, if I still have 3 minutes. So here's one. Not if, but when. Right? None of this is if. It is when. This is sort of the classic business school conclusion, right? And if that's the case, then yeah, it is all about speeding up deployment of existing technologies, or for that matter, figuring out how to get the balance right into the R&D necessary to then go to the next D, deployment, right? Research, development, deployment, demonstration, diffusion, and so on and so forth. Second point, there is a thing called the innovator's dilemma. And this is about as clear as it can be in a sector like cement and steel, for that matter. Right? The big question is, how much of those new technologies should be deployed when and by whom? Or put differently, yeah, there are some funky little startups, right? The tiny little ones that are not yet part of the Global Concrete and Cement Association, Cement and Concrete Association, sorry, GCCA, or World Steel for that matter, right? They're not producing anything quite yet. They have the fancy patents, and they are looking to the demonstration plant. And yeah, how do you do that? Well, you need money. You need lots of it, right? Back to this, just very briefly. Some of these fancy technologies, the thermal batteries, the electrochemical production, yeah, they are out there. They are just not being deployed at scale for all the obvious reasons. And the big question is how one scales those fancy new technologies in the context of large incumbents willing to spend money on new technologies when they make them money, and of course interested in frankly, squashing those new technologies, delaying their deployment when they currently don't. Which, of course, leads to the third and last point, which is who pays, right? So the big question, and as an economist, it's always hard to say that there is finite money in the world, right? There is not. The pie always grows, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, yeah, there are three sources of money in the world. It's shareholders, consumers, households, industrials paying for the cement, the steel, for example. And then there are taxpayers. And it's not a secret that there is a fierce political battle among those three groups, where, yes, the CEO of the cement company is going to earnestly say, of course, we are interested in doing X, Y, and Z, but we can't possibly ask our shareholders to pay for it, or our consumers for that matter. So please, subsidies. And that circle, of course, continues no matter where one looks. So when you then look at technologies that, like LC3, that actually pays for itself already under certain circumstances, there is the clear question now, who is best positioned to actually take advantage of this? And let me just end here. Happy to say much more in the Q&A about any of this, of course. But there are certain reasons to believe that sometimes it is developing emerging economies that are actually best positioned to deploy some of these newer technologies, in part because it is a fast-growing sector, in part because costs matter a lot, in part because they are not encrusted structures, tradition, lock-in effects at work, where, yes, Western players, very much looking at the cement industry now, are often looking to CCUS as the techno-fix, carbon capture and storage, right? The add-on that needs to be subsidized, the add-on that needs to be driven by policy, while some others in emerging economies are looking at the more efficiency-focused, cheaper, possibly more impactful technologies from the get-go. Thank you. Happy to continue this, and not to confuse matters, but just to show you how this could have easily been the steel talk as well. This is actually a steel plant, not a cement plant. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Wagner, for that presentation. It's always good to see to set up the stage with knowing where are these emissions focusing within the cement sector, where are some of the emerging technologies that could be invested all over the world, and obviously the constant need of being able to mobilize financing, appropriate financing towards those specific technologies. So now I'm going to pass it over to Darshak Mehta. He's a senior carbon capture and utilization specialist from the Asian Development Bank, and is going to present us a little bit about the ADB's take in some of these technologies, investing in some of these technologies, and some of the GHG methodologies, basics as well, that they use when considering these investments. Darshak, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm unable to share my camera, so excuse me for that. Let me share my screen now, and we'll just go from there. Just a second. Yep. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Darshak.
Okay. Thanks. I'll make it in full screen, and so that we can go on from there.
We can see it.
Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Wagner, for this very interesting opening remarks. Let me just try to go a little bit sector specific and try to show as to what may be done and how the different methodologies might be applied to understand and measure what is the emission reduction or what is the emission. Okay, so let's start with the fundamental thing as to what are the cement emissions, 8%, 7% that has been seen, and that is the world average. Some of the developing countries like Vietnam, it may go as high as 15%. Unlike cement, unlike steel, cement is generally produced locally. There is a distinct difference between cement and steel. Cement is almost everywhere, and steel a lot of time is specific to a specific geology, and that is why it is not produced everywhere. Generate the right side, on the right side, you can see a graph which is showing that per dollar of investment, cement is generating maximum amount of emission. That is how it is. So that gives you the reason why you need to be more careful with cement. If you see the investment pattern, the more you put in cement, the more you are going to get the emission. That's one of the things. It takes strict regulatory approval. Now, cement is a very specific animal wherein because of the nature of because of nature of the cement itself and the way it is used, the safety concerns are a lot. So because they are used in building and other things, so regulatory issues are playing a big role, and it takes some time to regulate, to introduce new process or new materials or new mixture, etc. So that is one of the things why cement is a little bit different from a lot of other things that you may want to decarbonize. Now, the next, let's go a little bit deeper into as to what is the whole life cycle of cement making, and at what stages, what is the emission and what is the energy that is being used. We start with the mining basically. Once the mining is done, that is the place where almost 3%, where 40%, 40 megajoule per ton of energy is used, and 3 kg per ton of cement, that is the emission that is taking place. Then you go to crushing, you go to transport, raw mill, and the biggest contributor to emission and electricity is coming through kiln process and the calcinator. So this is where the amount of energy used is the largest. Almost more than 70% energy is coming into kiln, and it is also contributing more than 70% of emission that is taking place. So kiln, calcinator, and pre-calcinator, that is one of the biggest contributor to emission. And so our biggest attention when we want to decarbonization, that will go to this place, followed by then later on the other processes, which will be cement mill, cooler, logistics, etc. Now, when we have seen all these different processes that are there in cement making, let's try to understand as to how do we now reduce the emission through this. So what are the options for that? When we go for mining and transport of the electrification of the vehicles, mining vehicles and biofuels, that is one of the places where you can try to reduce emission. When it comes to crushing, transport, and raw mill, this is where renewable electricity will help. Since electricity is used, again, SF6 emission will be there. Energy efficiency will always be helpful everywhere. Then comes the other aspect, the most important aspect, which is kiln and preheater. The options over here will be, one needs to see as to what is the fly ash blending, that is one of the things, or slag addition of cement, steel industry slag addition, that is another thing that can happen. The importance of this is that in case of when almost 60%, 50 to 60% of emission in case of cement making is actually coming from inherent cement making process, which is CaCO3 disintegrating into CO2 plus CaO. So the more you add fly ash or slag, that will tend to reduce the calcination process, and that is how we will be able to reduce it. Of course, one has to see the other characteristics of the ultimate cement that we are going to have before we go there. In the kiln, there is another thing that is contributing to emission, which is fossil fuel. Here, your options will be biomass firing, green hydrogen, which is, of course, as of now, current situation, it might not be cost effective. Then it is RDF, refuse derived fuel, that will be there. And of course, burner efficiency, etc. So these are the places where one can try to reduce the emission. and so on. Now, let's try to go to the next place. So when we want to see the emission reduction, ultimately, the emission reduction will start with baseline emission minus project emission. That is the old way of doing it. Rather than we don't go to the newer way of classification, let's go traditional way. So baseline is the most important thing that one has to see. So emission reduction calculation, how we go about it. Many a times we don't have the data to determine the baseline, and measuring baseline at each and every place will be little difficult. So one can go to a little bit of conservative way of setting the baselines little bit higher for lack of data, but we can arrive at some reasonable amount. So one can use the standardized baseline for grid electricity. That is one of the things we can do wherever there is. And in most of the large countries now, fortunately, grid electricity data and emission reduction, emission factors are available. Then one can also go for baseline setting based on established international or national standards, collection of past information or energy consumption in the when we have national regulation already. That is what will help in establishing plant-specific data. Then, but this is actually a fairly rigorous process. One has to establish those regulations, how to measure, etc. For a longer period of time, one has to standardize that, and then one can have the final numbers. But that is one of the best ways to do it. Then baseline from past registered or monitored projects that can be under CDM or JI, and that will help us in creating a very robust database. And again, standardized database, which can be on nationally or internationally approved agencies that can be used in some cases. Now, yeah, the emerging opportunities, various emerging, and these are some of the later opportunities which are there. One is use of graphene to strengthen the concrete. What it has done, and probably it is still very new. Addition of graphene can actually reduce your cement concrete use itself by 10% almost, and that can really help you. I mean, or one can say it can increase the strength in such a way that it will reduce your concrete usage by 10%. That is one of the things. Second thing, what Professor already advised us was use of LC3. That is one of the other things. Then the next thing is substitution of limestone will be to replace ordinary OPC with geopolymer cement. That is one of the methodologies which has come. One can the links are given. We can see it later on. But this is going to be really an interesting thing. Emission reduction in transport, of course, that is a modal shift option that is available to railway, and move to railways, move to something like shipping, etc. And that can work both for clinker as well as for the clinker as well as the finished product both. So that is one of the things one can do. Then change of fuel from fossil to biofuel. We have seen it already earlier. And these are the things. Cast concrete technology, that is one of the other technologies. Link is given over here. Whenever you have a time, it can be seen. Then when we are going, I mean, having understood the overall structure of, I mean, the opportunities, the structure of the methodologies which are there is like this. One is the applicability conditions of the methodologies will be there. Then physical and spatial boundaries. Additionality will have to be proven, because we don't want double accounting or business usual cases to creep into the projects when we are trying to get emission credits. Calculation formulas will be there. Monitoring and reporting plans will be there. And there will be a number of tools which will help us to determine grid emission factor, sustainability, methane emission calculation, etc. Now, issues in baselines will be when we are trying to switch the fuel, when there is a new plant, there will have to be really be a case where what do you take as your baseline fuel? Because baseline fuel generally will be coal, but there can be areas where baseline fuel may be natural gas because coal is not available, in which case the whole baseline will go up and emission reduction itself will come down. That is a likely possibility. Often, baseline setting is considered at current baseline, whatever is established practice in the current project. That is something that can happen. Uncertainties can be there when we are establishing new baseline conditions, which can be availability of fuel, availability of the regulation, availability of manpower, etc. So these also will have to be taken into account when we are establishing baseline. Then when we are mixing certain amount of fly ash in cement mixing, cement is when we are trying to consider this, just so sorry, this is okay. So sorry. Now, when fly ash is mixed in cement and for reducing emission, it may be possible that existing power plant, which is coal-fired power plant, which is a source for fly ash and emission reduction, what is likely to happen is that power plant itself is going to close down. So taking that for baseline will be an issue, or long regulatory approval, as I said earlier, when we want to mix fly ash, the regulators are more concerned about the basic strength of the cement itself by when we are mixing the fly ash with this. And that is something that will have to be considered, that they will take a long time to have a long time before fly ash will be coming up. Now, let's go by, I'm going by some of the examples which are available under Clean Development Mechanism. This is project 0473 for optimal utilization of clinker and substitution of clinker by fly ash in India, OCL. This is one of the projects. Now, in this project, fly ash usage is in PPC manufacturing. Infrastructure modifications are to be done. It requires improved in technological modification. Fly ash transport is added. Fly ash adding mechanism is to be introduced in the whole cement plant, and installation of cement vertical roller mill, that is to be, and improvised road back filters. These are all improvements that have to be done in the cement plant, and that is the compared to baseline condition. The methodology used for this particular project was ACM 002, and the registered project design document is available through this link. The additionality, how it was proven, is by using combined field, where technological barrier and market barrier was discussed. See, technological barrier is that all these improvements were not there, and for the first time, probably it was done in that particular country. Hence, the technological barrier was there. Market barrier is, of course, very important. People won't trust cement, which is having such kind of blending. So that is one of the very much recognized barrier that has been put up over there. When the monitoring was to be done post-project implementation, there were 34 parameters which are measured, and these are available in the cement sector itself. Calculations are available, how to calculate, what are the baseline conditions and what it was done. And leakage emission was considered from arrival of transportation of additional fly ash from different sources. So these were the ways of doing this calculation. And expected average emission, certified emission reduction was 12,000 tons of CO2 per year. Next is waste heat recovery. Now, this is again a project on waste heat recovery from JK Cement. In this case, a 13.2 megawatt power plant was was established to recover the heat from the kiln. And as you know, exit gases are at very high temperature. So this temperature was captured in generating electricity. Methodology used was ACM 004, and common practice analysis was proven to take that why this project is additional. I mean, normally, at least in that point of time, there was no no project or very little projects were available, which were actually recovering heat from the waste heat. So that is why this was there. Probably in today's condition, it may or may not be true in all the countries. Some countries may be so advanced that that establishing a waste heat recovery may be a normal practice, which one needs to see. Baseline was import of electricity from grid because it was the additional heat, waste heat, which was there, and it is at zero emission, which is generated. So, but the import of electricity from grid is the baseline emission, which was considered. Various parameters were to be considered for monitoring, which was the electricity generated by waste heat recovery project, its all auxiliary electricity consumption, emission factor of the grid, and fossil fuel consumed. These are the major things which were supposed to be done. And emission reductions were 70,000, almost 71,000 tons of CO2 per year. Third example is emission reduction through alternate fuel use, such as RDF or biofuel. So there was partial fuel switching to agriculture waste and refuse derived fuel at Kettamea cement plant. The methodology used was ACM 003. You may see that there are different methodologies used for different projects. Earlier project, if you see, it was ACM 004. Earlier than that, again, ACM 005. So different methodologies and different applicability conditions are applicable in all these projects, and one needs to be mindful of this particular thing. Project description is the project is to reduce CO2 emission from the cement plant through partial fuel substitution of natural gas by alternative fuels. In this case, agriculture residue and refuse derived fuels. So this plant, what they've said is, it was already using 87% of natural gas and 13% of heavy fuel oil in the baseline conditions. The additionality they have proven is that when we want to go for investment recovery by putting up the actual project, they will have to have an IRR of 22.88%. But if they just alter this scenario of 87% natural gas and 30% heavy fuel oil, it is likely, alternate fuel will be, then it is likely that there is going to be no further investment, and that is how they will have to go about it. So,
Darshak,
sorry.
Please, could you start wrapping up, please? Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. So that is the whole thing. When you are, this is again not considering the methane emission, and which is very much a part of RDF and biofuels. And the other links are there. I think this last part, I'll just leave it for now. It is too futuristic as of now, but let me just tell that it was carbon capture and utilization of capturing CO2, blending with hydrogen and making urea out of it. The numbers you can see over here, we can come back to that later on. And now these slides are giving the GHG emission methodologies which can be used in cement sector in case of CDM. Then current IFI methodologies are given in these slides. And considering the fact that we are not restricted only to CDM now, there is joint crediting mechanism which is coming up. Then joint implementation methodologies are there. Then there are voluntary carbon mechanisms are there. Then IATA, IMO, etc. are also there. So these are the other carbon markets which may be of use to you. Thank you. I hope, sorry for taking a little bit longer than needed, but this is all I can have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darshak. It has been extremely useful. I think particularly not just the methodological piece that I'm sure we're going to dip in a little bit more with the next presentations, but also the investments that the ADB has done and embedding for fly ash blending, waste heat recovery, and alternate fuel use in some of the projects. So that's definitely good to hear. And now I'm going to pass it over to Janak. I see a couple of questions in the chat, but Janak, over to you.
Thank you, Alfredo. And thank you, Professor Wagner, and thank you, Darshak. Excellent presentation and very useful. So one provides the very broader overview of the economics of cements, and then Darshak's presentation gives deep dive into more project specific levels. So it's always because these market methodologies are basically developed for developing countries, and cost effectiveness always doesn't work there. Even it's cost effective, there are a number of barriers that prevents them to for taking up these technologies that require the interventions, and that's how it tries to leverage this kind of the technology through the carbon market opportunities, etc. But then I think we'll discuss more on what's the difference between the additionality it's being seen under the carbon market versus the consistently, right? So what are the conflicts? And then maybe IFC's presentation will likely to cover more broader at sector level and national level using the decarbonization tool. What are the kind of decarbonization pathways that helps save countries in terms of designing policies, framework for promoting these kind of technologies through various opportunities. Maybe some can be done through consistency, some through carbon market, etc. There are two questions, so in the interest of time, I think we can limit questions for this session, but these are quite related to the next sessions, and we can also handle together. So first question from Ismail Hassan. What is the standard historical time frame or number of years required for establishing a greenhouse gas emissions baseline? I think this question goes to Darshak.
Yeah, thank you. I think, one needs to take into account the nature of business for which you are setting up the baseline, because one is there are seasonal variations also in some of the businesses. And in such cases, one needs to take into account at least 1 year's thing, but better will be more than 2 years, depending. And certain cases, yearly changes can also be established. One of the ways to establish baselines can also be to take the average emission level on per ton of basis of the cement production. If you are going for cement production, that may be really be good to give us a fairly good baseline number to begin with. And so probably that is how I would try to put up.
Yeah, thanks, Darshak. The second question is also related to baseline. So when you trap the energy from waste heat recovery and send to grid electricity, or you displace grid electricity, that grid electricity is like predominantly renewable. Or for example, if the grid electricity comes from 100% hydro, then that baseline apparently your emissions factor would be 0. So then how you can consider in those scenario? That's the second question.
I think this is a tough problem and very specific to at least 2 countries I can think of, ADB member countries. One is Nepal and probably the other is Laos, where such kind of issues may be there. And of course, third will be Bhutan also. So, and one of the ways can be that, and I stand to be corrected, probably Jana can help me to rephrase this answer. But one of the ways in case of Nepal, what I know is that part of the electricity sometime imported from India. And that is where the emission factor of combined emission factor of Nepal and India can be used to arrive at a more realistic number. And again, in case of Nepal, there is also seasonal. This is also related to seasonal variation. Certain times it is importing, certain times it is exporting. So that can also be one of the things. Or the third thing is, can by establishing this project, I mean, if I extend the same example further, that by establishing this project, probably the country would have exhausted all its current hydroelectric sources, and it will have to go completely for import of electricity, or completely go for, say, no diesel-based electricity generation. And that is how one can try to arrive at such a condition. Other than that, I cannot think of too much about it, but this is one of the best ways I can answer about it.
Thanks, Darshak. Is there a way, like, when a facility utilizes the waste heat recovery, and then anyway they will save the the kind of the cost which otherwise incurred to purchasing electricity from grid, so that will make their facility more efficient and cost effective, right? So there'll be a possibility like how this can be translated in terms of the possibly displacing the low emissive cement product in the market, or it will be more challenging.
Okay.
So this is not from the energy consumption perspective, but more from the the product, right? So the product become, I think they will be able to generate the product in a more cost-effective manner, because they are saving grid, but they are not saving emissions per se, right? If there is no import, like the import of electricity from like emissive grid, then even the chance is less. But yeah, so maybe we can discuss this aspect again, in the next session. These are some of the issues where, the carbon market, carbon finance always would not help. But I think this is like a kind of important interventions to make the facility more efficient, right? So that this facility can prove that how efficient they can be using waste heat recovery. Even you don't see the prospect of reducing emissions, but at least this comes like in terms of resource efficiency. But there are barriers. It's a cost that would incur, like the capex, in terms of introducing technologies for waste heat recovery, and they need support from MDBs. Then what are the metrics that MDBs would need to think in terms of resource efficiency and make these technologies work for them, right? Without carbon market support. So I think these are the kind of the discussions that would require in terms of additionality and consistency. There is another question. Maybe that's the last question. Then next, I think I will defer to the next session. There is one. Most of the time, the challenge we are facing to use naturally available pozzolan material like pumic is the moisture content, which affects grinding efficiency. What mechanisms should we use to optimize this naturally available material? Maybe question to Professor Wagner.
Perhaps actually, so I think the high level answer, and again, just to be clear, right, I'm not a cement greenhouse gas accountant myself, is that whatever system we set up, of course, ought to nudge, shove, push us in the direction to use the lower carbon material, right? And I guess the short version on all of this is thinking through the unintended consequences is a key function here from the get-go. And actually, so again, this is very high level, I realize, but my experience, part of this greenhouse gas accounting working group now trying to revise those global standards set up by World Resource Institute and others. 90% of the discussion is spent on those unintended consequences. right? So it seems fairly simple. Simple might be an overstatement. To get the basics right. Right. So if hydropower is used, or if natural materials are used, and standards are and greenhouse gas emissions are a lot lower, it seems very simple to use a different emissions factor and get to a lower overall carbon footprint. Those unintended consequences are everywhere. So just for example, I realize this is not the specific question now, but biofuels, biomass as an alternative fuel that, yes, if done correctly, lowers emissions. Done correctly means not assuming, for example, that the use of biomass is simply carbon neutral in and of itself. It's not. Well, that's an example that regulators have gotten wrong all over the world, including, for example, Brussels, including the European Union. Getting that right from the get-go, setting the right incentives, is, of course, key. And sorry, that was a long-winded answer to a very specific question without me answering the question. But I think that's exactly the principle in the background that we need to keep in mind. Right, if the carbon footprint of the natural material is a lot lower, okay, yes, let's set the accounting standard to push in that direction, as long as we are confident that that is in fact the case.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wagner. And I really want to, hand over to IFC and see how some of these aspects are, are dealt with within the decarbonization tool. And there will be opportunities, I think, again, to discuss some of these technical, very, very detailed technical aspects. And also feel free, like any of the presenters who can answer, offline over the chat. Maybe you can also have like your written responses. There are a few questions related to baseline. So either you can attend, my request is like for Darshak also look at the questions, and also Professor Wagner, feel free to, answer if you can in the meantime. So I will hand over to IFC. Alfredo.
First, thank you very much, Janak, and thank you to both speakers for your questions. As Janak well said, there are actually at least one question for each one of you on the chat, so we would definitely appreciate it if you could help answering that offline. But in the meantime, let's actually go to a very exciting presentation from our IFC colleagues. We have both Margarita Talavera, she's a Senior Investment Officer and Construction Materials Lead with the IFC, and we have Claudine Mordes, Senior Industry Specialist, and the lead for the cement decarbonization tool. Over to you, Margarita.
Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hopefully you can see my screen and hear me correctly. So as Alfredo said, we'll have two sets of presentations. I'll talk a bit more about what IFC does on the cement side in emerging markets and how we support companies and our clients. And then Claudine will go deeper into the discussion of the cement decarbonization tool, which
Margarita, we cannot still see your screen, just FYI.
Oh, let me just try to share it again. Oh, does that work now?
Yeah, it's working now.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Thank you. So let me just run you through a couple of slides just to explain, give you an overview of what we do. So we're the part of the World Bank Group, and I think many of you are familiar with the World Bank Group and the work that we do with governments and on the policy side, and supporting also infrastructure development. We focus primarily on supporting the private sector as a key driver of economic and social development. And we provide different types of financial instruments and mobilizing resources, and have been working in emerging markets for over 65 years. We've invested close to 400 billion since our foundation in 1956, and we're owned by 186 member countries and have global presence in over 100 countries across different regions, and work with close to 2,000 private sector clients. We have a portfolio of about $90 billion. And as you can see from this geographic distribution of of our portfolio as of fiscal year 25. We have a very strong participation in Asia, Latin America, and in Africa. In terms of IFC specifically, as I mentioned, we work primarily with the private sector, and we support investments in best practice technologies in emerging markets. Over the last 25 years, we've committed approximately 5.3 billion in investments, of which 3.5 billion are from our own account. Over this period, we have more than 80 projects globally across more than 30 countries, and we have in-house expertise through our seasoned industry specialists that actually have worked in the industry, that are a key part of our due diligence and project assessment process. We are a sustainability leader, promoting environmental and social standards as well as corporate governance standards. And in terms of our distribution for the IFC commitments in this sector, over the last 25 years, Africa has really led the majority of our work. That's where we have the majority of our portfolio, and followed by Central Asia, Middle East, and Turkey. And I wanted to highlight, and we do publish all of our projects that we do are publicly disclosed on our website. I will put the link in the chat in case you also want to see. But we work, as mentioned, across different regions with local, regional, and global sponsors. And maybe I'll highlight two projects. I'll focus on the Votorantim Cementos project that we committed in 2023, which was a sustainability-linked loan, and this is in Brazil. The objective of the project was to increase the co-processing capacity by upgrading one of Votorantim plants in Sao Paulo to allow the plant to process a wide range of waste materials. The investment is expected to double the site's capacity to use alternative fuels from about 30% to 70%. And we also supported, alongside this investment, Votorantim with its go-to-market strategy for its co-processing plant, and in aligning its emission reduction targets with Paris alignment. So we supported the company in also assessing its decarbonization roadmap and validating the prioritization of its investment plan by leveraging our cement decarbonization tool with Claudine, which Claudine will talk to you about in a few minutes. The other project that I also would like to highlight is the CMAF in Western Africa. The last loan, so this has been an IFC client since 2021. So we've supported the company and its subsidiaries with a series of loans and mobilization package. But the last loan we committed in 2023, we supported the construction of a calcine clay production facility in Burkina Faso, and also helped the company finance solar PV facilities in 3 subsidiaries in Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali. The project will increase the availability of lower carbon, cost-efficient cement in 3 Sahel countries, supporting the region's infrastructure and housing development programs. The calcine clay project will reduce the use of clinker, leading to increased energy efficiency and also a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, while the solar PV projects will help CMAF reduce its reliance on fossil fuels for power generation. So really, across all these projects, if you go into our disclosure website, you will see that they all have an element of helping companies adopt or upgrade to best available technologies and increase efficiency of their operations. Moving to the next, I think, as Professor Wagner and my other colleagues on the call highlighted, cement is a hard-to-abate sector with significant climate change impact. It is a key ingredient of concrete, and it's the second most used substance in the world after water. So it's actually a critical material for buildings and infrastructure. and 66% of growth in demand for heavy industry products, including cement, is expected to take place over the next 10 years, and the majority will be in emerging markets, right? So emerging markets account for approximately 23% of emissions intensity reduction in cement required by the cement sector by 2030, required to reach net zero. So it is important, right, that we work closely together with key stakeholders in trying to support the decarbonization of cement in emerging markets. Now, I wanted to also highlight some of the challenges that we have seen, that clients face in emerging markets to scale decarbonization investments. One, which has already been mentioned, right, are the financial constraints. So there's a significant upfront capital investment and limited commercial viability and lack of low carbon premium carbon markets required for deep decarbonization projects. So there's different types of decarbonization levers. Some of them are in the money, right, and don't require, how do you say, a concessionality that was spoken a few minutes ago. But others, right, such as CCUS or newer technologies that have a significant impact on carbon reduction do have commercial viability gaps that need to be addressed. No? There's also technical and operational challenges, outdated technologies in emerging markets that may result in higher emissions, limited availability of commercially viable technologies to address the inherent emissions due to the low level of maturity or industrial patents. You also have limitations from the access to alternative materials and fuels, so limited access to cost competitive alternative materials to reduce the clinker ratio, and limited access to alternative fuels to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels is also another limitations that companies face. And then there's the regulatory and policy gaps, right? Emerging markets may also have limited regulatory framework or outdated building codes and construction standards that enable the use of alternative materials and fuels by cement manufacturers. Or there also could be an absence of incentives or penalties to push industrials to invest in decarbonization, such as carbon tax, which was already mentioned by another presenter, or emissions reduction targets, and grid carbon intensity and reliability. So with all of these challenges, right, the decarbonization of cement requires a new paradigm in emerging markets. The speed of project execution is critical. Underwriting with partner institutions and public-private sector collaboration has become more crucial, right, to be able to really scale these investments in emerging markets. So we need to be quicker in mobilizing with our establishing relationship with a cohort of DFIs, commercial institutions, and different types of fund providers, so that we're able to bring adequate financial solutions to emerging markets. We also have to work to collaborate with different stakeholders on developing risk mitigation and blended finance solutions to also close the commercial viability and the financial gaps that some of these projects have. And then we also have to work together on catalyzing innovation through supporting venture capital investments, right, in new emerging technologies, and try to get these piloted, so that they can demonstrate their technical feasibility and close the commercial viability gap. So our approach in the cement industry focuses in supporting companies that are pursuing low carbon investments that enhance competitiveness and sustainability of their operations. We support sustainable production of cement, prioritizing projects that are geared towards increasing sustainability, enhancing sustainability. We provide long-term financing, sustainability, and green labeled financial solutions. We support clients in modernizing their kilns and boosting efficiencies and switching to alternative fuels, such as biomass and refuse-derived fuels. We support companies in defining or validating and enhancing their decarbonization roadmaps. We help accelerate technology and innovation transfer to emerging markets. So we encourage the adoption of digitalization and AI to optimize skill operations, improve energy use, and reduce waste. We support and promote the use of production of blended cements to reduce the clinker to cement ratio. We also support clients on R&D investments, including partnerships of new cement products. And we enable clients and support clients in the piloting of renewable energy integration, waste heat recovery, and green hydrogen feasibility. And finally, we are working with governments and different stakeholders in building and enabling ecosystem that really supports the scaling of these investments in emerging markets. We promote circular value chains by advancing carbon cured concrete, recycling, and environmental product declarations. And through the deployment of the IFC cement decarbonization tool, we also, help clients map their emission sources and prioritize abatement investments. In terms of the cement decarbonization tool, and Claudine will go more into details on how actually this is, this looks in practice and the type of information that we gather from this tool. It's the first step in the decarbonization journey for companies. The tool generates MAC curves that allow the ranking of investment projects by cost and show the expected impact in terms of dollar per ton of CO2 equivalent, and with the purpose of helping companies identify the most viable and the most impactful investments and help them in prioritizing their investment plans. It's based on the MAC curve. Based on the MAP curve, that we can help structure decarbonization pathways and financing solutions for our prospective clients. And I think Professor Wagner showed a bit of what the MAP curve looks like, and then Claudine will go a little bit more into details on how it works. So through this tool, we believe that we're also adding value to our clients, by providing a bit more visibility of their baseline, but more importantly of how some of the investments that they can prioritize really can have an impact and a financial return of their investments. So we have a team. The majority of us are on this call that focus on construction and other base materials. We're happy to address any questions that you may have. We work very closely and as part of the Knowledge Bank. Our team is part of the Knowledge Bank with the World Bank Group. We work very closely with our policy team on also supporting, bringing the private sector inputs on policy development, because again, governments also play a key role in generating an enabling environment so that we can really scale decarbonization in emerging markets. I look forward to the discussion, and I'll turn it over to Claudine so that she can provide a much more detailed description of our cement decarbonization tool and the implementation in some of the projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita, for that presentation. And I think we go straight into Claudine's presentation. Definitely looking forward to it.
Good day, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see the presentation.
Great. Sorry, just trying to get myself organized. As indicated, my name is Claudine Morgas. I'm a senior industry advisor for the IFC based in Washington, D.C. And my background has been predominantly in mining and manufacturing, with the largest part of my career in cement operations in Southern Africa. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. And I hope in the next 10, maximum 15 minutes, I am able to share a little bit about the cement decarbonization tool, and specifically on the value add from the tool, moving from measurement to investment decision, and to be quite explicit about where the tool is applicable and what the limitations are, so it's appropriately used by the team members here. So I think let's start with the why, but I don't think I even need the why. I think it's been explained enough by my predecessors. It is clear that we need to move from, credible baseline modeling to mitigation estimates that stand up in investment plans and can support a pipeline that actually mobilizes finance. So what did we envision for the tool, or what was the reason we created the tool? The aim was to have a decision support and business development tool to help cement companies specifically identify decarbonization opportunities and assess what feasibility studies to actively pursue and potentially aid in facilitating green and sustainability-linked financing, which Margarita has already spoken about. So it provides a very high-level first-cut analysis, I must indicate, of decarbonization levers on the pathway to net zero, very importantly. So it lays the foundation for the engineering feasibility work rather than replacing it. So it starts very high level. In other words, it helps team move faster from, we have baseline numbers as a company, or this is the baseline for our kiln, to we have prioritized a short list of measures worth developing into investable projects. So to place it in context, and I think this has been discussed by previous presenters, the sector has identified multiple levers that are needed to achieve net zero. And these levers mature at different speeds. The practical planning challenge is sequencing and prioritizing. So what is feasible and commercially viable now? What becomes necessary beyond 2030, but still faces viability gaps? And what is emerging and needs upstream support? That's where you go to your A, B, and C buckets mentioned here. A buckets are the technically and commercially viable. B is technically viable, but needs some commercial support. And then the C buckets, where things like CCUS come in, still need support in development. So if I go to the IFC and the IFC's approach, just taking a step back, GHG assessments have evolved. Initially, assessments could be more qualitative. But as net zero targets have become clearer and clearer, there's been need for better quantitative signals, and thus the development of the tool. It is aimed to help clients and cement clients specifically understand their key levers and their potential to impact Scope 1 and Scope 2. I must state that the scope is Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and is modeled around the GCCA's GHG protocol. The IFC has, however, also partnered with a company called Sustain 360 to pilot a more comprehensive approach that covers Scope 1, 2, and 3, and the broader life cycle attributes. For those of you who may have attended the previous session, you would have been introduced to Sustain 360. So I must state that the tool itself focuses on the GCCA methodology and on Scope 1 and Scope 2. And the reason is because, emissions specifically for pure play, cement and clinker companies, the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions make up the largest part of, the GHG emissions of the company. And I think that was mentioned, even by Daksha. So the way to interpret this is that the tool is a practical engine for early screening and prioritization, while a more comprehensive approaches can complement it where a full life cycle view is required. So quickly, in a nutshell, the methodology, as indicated, is based on the GCCA's CO2 and energy protocol, which is widely used by the industry, standard for reporting cement emissions. The tool, again, focuses on Scope 1 and Scope 2, direct and indirect emissions, and it requires a select amount of operational data, including screenshots from control rooms, and is a pragmatic way to anchor estimates in operating reality. So what it does is it starts off with a point-in-time baseline of your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, an estimate of it, and then we look at 5 decarbonization levers, and I'll talk a bit about them in the next slide. So it says, okay, this is now my baseline, as at now, what my emissions are, and if I employ some of these, maybe all of these, my future will be this, and it looks at it from a specific emission, CO2 per ton of clinker and CO2 per ton of cement. I'll go into the actual levers, but what it also does, it has the ability to provide a very high level order of magnitude CapEx and payback estimates for these levers. The value add is that it shifts the conversation from aspiration to a structured shortlist that measures what matters most, what the abatement potential looks like, and what the indicative investment logic is, enough to prioritize what should move into the pipeline to be developed. So I must state, though, that this is aimed at being a facilitated intervention. So the tool itself is not something that is kind of plug and play, where you can just put your data in and you get the answer at the end. I mean, we would have to be involved to assist in actually developing that plan, because it hasn't been developed to the level where you can just input your data. So to give you just an idea of the type of information, it's plant information, it's indicated. You start with, your clinker, your kilns, some input data there. Also, your fuel emissions data is important. Your energy inputs, what type of energy, clean energy, whether it's off grid. We look at grinding equipment and other key pieces of equipment. And then what assists is just if we have screenshots from the control room, but also information on key pieces of equipment, what type of equipment is used. So this is the type of input that goes in. And, generally we haven't had major issues in obtaining the information. Where the information is not available, there are standards in the methodology which can be used where the actual information is not available. So the tool is designed around the 5 levers, as I mentioned. And the levers themselves are alternate fuels. So we start with, things like, excuse me, what different types of alternate fuels that can be used, your electricity or power mix, what are their options, such as wind, solar, blended cements. So we spoke about things like substituting limestone, pozzolana, calcined clay, fly ash and slag. Waste heat recovery was spoken about. If we had to institute waste heat recovery, what are your options there? And then also select equipment configuration. So if you had to replace maybe some older equipment or change your equipment configuration, what the impact on GHG emissions downstream would be. These levers were chosen because they basically sit into the buckets I mentioned earlier, your A and B buckets, which are technically viable solutions and often commercially viable solutions, or sometimes they are definitely technically viable, but may need some commercial support. And that's the reason we focus on this scope in particular. So what is the outcome at the end of it? What you end up with is, the outputs are designed to show you a prioritized set of investments, a technically financially viable view. So total identified investments for viable projects, the GHG abatement potential over the lifetime of the project, and the marginal abatement cost curve, as Margarita and others have mentioned, alongside initial recommendations for operational improvements. So for investment plans, this is powerful because it helps explain not only what reduces emissions, but what should be prioritized first, with a consistent logic that links measures to abatement and indicative economics. The key limitation to keep in mind is that the CapEx and payback estimates are generally order of magnitude. So it's appropriate for screening prioritization and not to substitute full feasibility studies or analysis. So it's kind of the starting point. This is what you need to focus on to get you on your journey to, to net zero eventually. So it aids companies, and in turn, as companies adopt this, it can aid a country achieve their GHG reduction targets. So I think that is it for me. Happy to take any questions. It's a high-level summary, but and I think hopefully I've saved some time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudine, for that presentation, and Margarita for the presentation. Both of them definitely fascinating. It's always good to see the role, the catalyzing role that definitely IFC's funding has in decarbonizing all these different sectors, particularly cement. And I think it's also fascinating to see the work that the IFC cement decarbonization tool does. We've seen the level of input that it's required, but also the fact that it's IFC supports the usage throughout the whole utilization process of the tool itself. So definitely looking forward. I've seen that there are lots of questions in the chat, so I'm gonna refer it over to Janak, over to you to lead this Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Alfredo. And thank you, Margarita and Claudine, for your very insightful presentations. There are a couple of questions on the chat. So yeah, maybe also feel free to ask more questions. Here is the time now. I just want to have like two quick questions to Margaret and Claudine, I think for the benefits of the clients. So it would be interesting to understand, like, out of the cement projects that IFC has assessed using this decarbonization tool, what proportion of these projects really reach to the investment stage? And are there any common reasons that a specific project falls out? And like, maybe is it because of the weakness on setting baselines, the technology cost projections, or any market regulatory factors? This is the first question. And the second question, I see that this tool is validated by the Research Academy, European Cement Research Academy. I'm curious, how well do its benchmark and default translates to developing country context? Yeah, particularly where you see the plant's vintage is quite older, fuel mixes are unusual, and then the grid emission factors, they are quite volatile. So two questions. I just want to have your quick reflections.
Claudine, do you want me to take the first one?
And
On
I'll
the
take
concept
the
one?
Sure, and I'll
Yeah.
take the second.
Okay, perfect. So on how we differentiate projects or how we assess project at the concept stage, we look at different things. So I think what makes a project successful, or we consider that could be successful, right, is obviously the sponsor and the company's experience and track record in the sector and in the country, because each country has different dynamics, right? So even if the sponsor might not have experience in that specific country, just the technical partners or the partnerships that it's trying to develop, it's a good, it can be a good indication of how the success of the project. We also look very closely at concept stage at the project rationale. I mean, obviously, these investments, as we were mentioning, there's different types of investments and categories, as Claudine was highlighting, right? So you have investments that will have an adequate financial return, and then you move towards those that have a commercial viability. So we also try to assess, where exactly the investment is at. And what's really the rationale, right? If it's to enhance competitiveness, efficiency, cost improvements, or just overall reduce emissions. I think Professor Wagner, in his response to a previous question, was highlighting, right, that it's not a one size fits all. So we are not going to push technologies that do not make sense in a country market, right? In a market context. So we look that it's the best available technology, but that it fits the market context and the country specific context. We also look at the supporting market dynamics, and here we take a look at initial supply and demand. And any policies and regulations that may be supportive or may be hindering or could hinder the potential project. Obviously, at concept stage, we have very limited information. It's at the due diligence stage that we go deeply into these topics, but at least at concept stage, we have to have an initial idea of how this panorama looks like to really see if it's worthy taking forward the project. So hopefully that addresses that question. Claudine, over to you for the other question.
Okay. So you mentioned ECRA, which is the European Cement and Research Academy. Yes, it is validated by ECRA, and ECRA was very closely involved with the Global Cement and Concrete Association in developing the GHG protocol, which this tool is based on, and which many cement companies, a large number of them, in fact, most of them, use to develop, their GHG emission baselines. And the tool is able to accommodate, scenarios across from emerging markets, to developed economies. There are, what should I say, default emissions numbers or default, where actual data is not available, because, the GCCA has members across the spectrum from, developed to emerging markets. And we have applied the tool to cement companies, for example, in Iraq is an example, in Pakistan, in Brazil. Margarita mentioned Votorantim Cementos. So we were able to successfully use the tool to develop baselines, as well as the investment or a selection of investments that could be deployed to reduce emissions. So it is quite flexible from that perspective. I hope that answers the question. Maybe if I can go back to the question on the moisture content in pumice. I think it was a question raised, that often you can use these alternate materials, to reduce your GHG emissions, pumice specifically in the mill, to as a substitute for clinker. I've experienced it myself when moisture has been an issue. Unfortunately, the way we resolved it was with upstream drying. It's not ideal because sometimes you may need to use additional fuel, but what you can do is use the waste heat from the kiln or even from the cooler that's also being deployed. That's often the scenarios that are used in order to, to try and get the moisture content down to below 5%. And then, milling becomes easier than, with the wet material. Sorry, so just going back to a question, maybe just to comment on. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Claudine. There are a couple of questions related to the use of biomass. So one is related to one is from Edisu. Is asking at what thermal substitution rates does RDF and biomass deliver maximum economic benefits while still meeting emission limits and kiln stability requirements? That's the first question on biomass, and there are two.
Maybe if I can comment on that, I think it's very, very specific to the biomass, the moisture content, the calorific value of either the biomass or the RDF, the kiln itself, what actual equipment we have. So unfortunately, it's not, a one size fits all. And also the commercial aspects, play a big role. Are there subsidies or are there incentives to use the RDF in a specific country? For example, in more developed countries, it pays to use biomass because of the CO2 tax. So it's not always easy to give a one answer that this is it. This is the substitution, the TSR level you need to be at to make it payable. It depends on the actual kiln system itself as well. What type of upgrades need to be done. Some may need very, just feeding systems, minor adjustments. Others may need more, like burner replacements, etc. So it is quite specific, and each scenario would have to be assessed, on a case-by-case basis, from my experience.
Yeah, there is another question related to biomass again. How does IFC evaluate emissions reduction potential of biomass fuels used in cement production, especially invasive biomass such as Prosopis juliflora? And then related question is, what are the key technical and financial indicators IFC looks for before investing in such industrial biomass fuel switching projects?
Maybe if I can take the biomass question, how do we assess it? So the tool follows the GHG protocol. So as I say, we look at direct and indirect emissions and gross and net methodology. And biomass is excluded, if I'm not mistaken, from the emissions from your total cement emissions are excluded on biomass from the gross side. So the methodology does take into account and factor in and considers biomass emissions from biomass as zero, aligned with the GHG protocol. But we can go into a deeper conversation if I'm maybe confusing the situation. But it does take into account or nullifies the biomass emissions. Sorry, and the second question. Yes.
And maybe just to add to that, when assessing projects that will use biomass as part of the alternative fuels, right, the mix, we also take into account the source, right? We want to make sure that that we understand where that biomass is coming from, so that it doesn't generate deforestation, right? So there has to be, we do take into account the supply chain, right? And analyze that supply chain for purposes of the overall sustainability of the project and overall benefit, right, that the project will have. And maybe going back also to the question on the policy and regulatory frameworks, right? As Claudine was saying, projects need to be able to adopt these changes, right? They need a supporting policy and regulatory environment, which allows them to be able to, to use either alternative materials or alternative fuels, right? So this comes down to just regulations, but also, building codes in terms of the use of alternative materials, right? They do need to allow for a different mix, a different recipe for cement, different levels of alternative or clinker factor levels, right? That will allow companies to deliver cement that has the same strengths and the same functions, right? But with different clinker ratios. So we feel that sometimes emerging markets may have outdated or very rigid building codes that may limit also companies in adopting some of these technologies that may be in the money, but because of this regulatory or codes limitation, there's not really market adoption. So there are things that governments can do to drive demand, both from a regulatory building code framework and also, for example, green procurement, right, which is another topic that many of the DFIs are also working closely with governments on how to scale or develop green procurement policies that can also generate this demand for greener construction materials.
Sorry, if I maybe just could also comment on the actual, you mentioned Prosopis juliflora, which is an invasive biomass. So that would be something we would support because it's invasive. You're not planting to obviously, use the biomass itself. So it would be an example of a project we would be interested to look at.
Yeah, and Claudine or Margarita, does IFC require, clients to produce any certification, like to demonstrate that biomass is, is sustainability, it's coming from the sustainable source, kind of a sustainability certification schemes for any use of biomass?
Maybe if I can answer, I think generally we would, if we're going to look at a project and invest in a project, we would do an on-site actual visit to understand the source, not necessarily a specific certification, but to validate, where it's coming from. Is it going to make a positive impact? I don't know, Margarita, if you want to add, that's generally how we would do it.
Yeah. And depending on the type of waste, right, that's being used, of bio waste, we do require the traceability, right, the company to have in place certain mechanisms to be able to understand where that waste is coming from, and where if there's a certification available in the country, because again, it's also country specific. We may require a certain certification. So, for example, in other projects, not necessarily in cement, where they used wood waste, right? We may require that wood waste to have a certain forestry sustainability certification that may be available in the country, and if that certification is not available, for the company to try to replicate, right, the traceability and have a third party validate that supply source. So we do look closely at that, but the certification really depends on whether it's available or not in a specific market, and if not available, what could be a proxy, right, of having a third party review, right, the traceability of that source.
Thanks, Claudine. There is a last question I see on the dashboard here. It's about the categorization of scope 1 and scope 2. So whether the decarbonization tool allow clear distinctions in terms of reporting scope 1 and scope 2, and whether IFC has a policy to disclose, scope 1 and scope 2 at portfolio level.
So the tool does separately report scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So it does separate the two. But when evaluating projects, we look at the emissions in aggregate, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Does IFC make any distinction by scope in portfolio level GHG monitoring and reporting? Not from my understanding, no. I think we normally would aggregate the emissions, from a reporting perspective. Margarita, you may want to comment as well.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
We don't specifically say, okay, this is the impact on scope 1, this is the impact on scope 2. It's generally, consolidated emissions reduction from these initiatives.
Yeah, any follow-up questions or any additional questions? Otherwise, we can move to the next session.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you, Margarita and Claudine, for those. But a definitely fascinating round of Q&A. I think I was talking to a couple of colleagues internally, but this has been definitely by far the most active chat in terms of Q&A that we've been in the webinar. So highly encourage everyone to continue that way for the remaining of the session. And I think there are a couple of questions there that will benefit from to get some answers from the speakers if possible. But yes, big thank you to everyone who spoke on this first part of the session on cement. But now we are moving to the second part, which is we're going to be speaking about decarbonizing steel and GHG emissions modeling around the steel industry. And for that, we're going to start by setting up the stage with Dr. Rizwan Hanhua. He's a head of technology at the World Steel Association. Dr. Rizwan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alfredo. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. Big thanks to Seth to talk about the decarbonization and the very big topic of greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll just give you a very brief overview of the steel industry greenhouse gas emissions and what the steel industry is trying to do in terms of finding ways of decarbonizing itself in terms of technology. And then we will have a look what does the future look like going forward over the next 3-4 decades. And because it's a very energy intensive industry, we are going to have a look how the decarbonization very quickly, very nicely integrates into the very broad question of energy. And then we are going to just have a look on what the transformation looks like in big numbers, and then I will just wrap it up with a bit of summary. So some of you might be familiar that we have been reporting the greenhouse gas emissions for quite a while now, over 15 years. So those numbers that you have on your screen at the very top row, these are the ones that were originally being reported. And these are purely CO2 emissions. So because there are several ways of making iron and steel, so we can classify them in 3 very broad categories. The basic oxygen furnace, blast furnace route, comes out at 2.34 tons of CO2 per ton of crude steel. Scrap EAF uses much less carbon sources of energy, so that's why emissions are a bit low. The DRI EAF also is coming from the primary sources of iron, so that's why the emissions are a bit higher there. And the global emissions, they are calculated based on the weighted average, depending on what the setup looks like. But since 1 or 2 years now, we have started reporting the other emission sources, for example, the methane, the nitrous oxides, both from the upstream sides, from mining and transportation and other sources there. So that brings the number a bit higher. We get quite often the question that why do these numbers look like different? So the explanation is that now we are reporting everything in the CO2 equivalent. So that's why these numbers are a bit higher. So how we see the steel industry transforming over the next decades? It's very difficult to put a timeline or a very clear distinction between those stages, but we can, for the sake of argument, divide that transformation into three regions. The first one is the optimization, where we, working with the existing technology, try to squeeze as much efficiency out of the current technologies through process improvement, energy saving, process yield improvement, raw material quality beneficiation. And then the transition stage, where you have already heard about the retrofitting of the bolt-on technologies or processes like carbon capture and storage, injecting other alternative fuel sources which are low carbon, for example, the biomass and hydrogen into the existing technologies. And then the very transformative process, which is the green technologies, where we start replacing the very high carbon intensive processes with the low energy processes, for example, using high quality scrap, making high quality steel out of it, and then the very transformative processes like using hydrogen direct reduction processes. Of course, the whole world is not going to move in a seamless fashion through all of these stages. So some of these stages will be a bit quicker, and some of them are going to take a bit longer in different parts of the world, depending on where you are. For example, China and India and Southeast Asia, they have got a very younger blast furnace fleet. So it might take, stages 1 and 2 might take a bit longer. And of course, there are also obstacles that we are going to touch upon in the subsequent slides there. How do we go about finding ways of having our hands on green sources of energy, and what are those obstacles? The raw material quality, for example, is one of those obstacles, together with the green energy. So the pressure points are not only the energy intensity reduction, but of course, where do we get those energy sources from? Because it's a very energy intensive processes, so we will require much larger amounts of those green sources of energy. And that's quite a big question that is on the mind of everybody, for the steel industry, including the cement, as we have heard. So how does the world look like now and in 2050? So there are all sorts of projections and scenarios that have been talked about there. Looking at the current, 2019 is a bit old now, but still we can see on the left hand side that if we were to put a split between the sources of between the different processes by which we make iron and steel, so the blast furnace BUF process constitutes to roughly 2/3 and 1/3 coming from the EAF processes. In 2050, these processes are going to be very radically transformed there, where we are going to have more output coming out of the EAF process than the BUF process. But that is not reflected very nicely in terms of the metallics input to those processes there. So if you look at on your right hand side, you will see that the iron still, and that by that I mean the virgin iron, still is the predominant input to those processes. We are going to have access to large amounts of scrap, but we cannot replace all of our inputs with scrap, because there is quite a number of those constraints there, because some of the steel grades require high purity, and that only comes from the virgin iron. Besides, there are several economies that are going to go through that whole transformation. So unless all of that scrap comes back, there will be quite a big time gap. So as I said there earlier, there are two basic modes of iron and steel production. The biggest one, BF-BOF, right now constituting to 2/3 of the output. And then we have got the scrap-based EF, roughly 1/3. But there is a very small amount coming from the direct reduction, which uses predominantly natural gas right now, which is 5%. The 2050 outlook tells us that this third one is going to quadruple. But that not all of that is going to be run by the natural gas or by hydrogen, so there will be kind of a 50-50 split among these. And the reason why we cannot go all hydrogen is going to come in the subsequent slides there. So let's have a look on what technologies that the steel industry is working on. So there are different ways of avoiding carbon intensity. So the first bracket is that we stop using carbon by, for example, using green sources of electricity, produce hydrogen and use those in our processes, either by direct reduction or electrolysis or melting scrap and then producing steel out of that. And then there are some novel ones also that we are working on, which are a bit lower on the technology readiness level 4 to 6 right now. The carbon recycling uses mostly the bolt-on processes, for example, using carbon capture and storage with the existing technologies, or smelting reduction using carbon capture and storage. The carbon reduction is where we use natural gas, of course, because it's still a lower CO2 intensive process as compared to using blast furnaces, is at a higher level of TRL level. And then if we talk about the biomass, biochar, there are still some time or some way to go because it is still at a lower TRL level. And then we are talking about the energy sources. Again, quite a number of those initiatives, incentives hinge on the provision of green sources of energy. The raw material, of course, is one of those obstacles as well, because the current technologies which are pioneering or leading the way to decarbonization rely very heavily on the high quality iron grades. So until we find the ways of using medium to low grade iron ores, we will have to see quite a number of those processes still running on the carbon intensive processes. And of course, if you look at the second to last row, the CO2 intensity in kilogram of CO2 per ton of crude steel, there is a big spectrum of those CO2 reductions possible there. Scrap, for example, is the lowest CO2 intensive process, but it relies very heavily on how decarbonized the grid is. So unless the grid is completely decarbonized, we will still see quite a lot of CO2 intensity in that process route. Because I have outlined that energy is one of those biggest bottlenecks. If we look at the different industries, if you look on your right hand side, iron and steel rely quite heavily on the energy that comes out of the earth, coal, natural gas, oil. So constituting to altogether roughly 75 to 80% of the energy input to those processes. Because every industrial sector and every part of the concerned society is trying to move away from the fossil sources of energy, if we look at the outlook from now until 2060, so by 2030, we see that the energy demand peaking. And from that time onwards, we see there are projections that more and more removal of carbon from our input to various industrial processes. Not only steel, but cement and in various other sectors. So coal, oil, natural gas, they are going to start reducing and will be replaced by other non-fossil fuels, solar, wind, nuclear. So that gives us quite a big hope, but also reminds us that not everything can be decarbonized as we would like to hope. So some of the projections that you might see coming from the International Energy Agency, those are aspirational figures. But that does not mean that everything that we aspire can be translated into practical means or realities. So this data is coming from DNV, which is a think tank and a consulting agency from Norway. So they have got much more realistic figure based on ground realities. So that's why I'm using these figures here. So the share of non-fossils is going to increase from 20% what we have now all the way to 63%. And from that point on, we will start struggling to those ceilings where it takes much more effort to decarbonize than we would like to hope. And what are those constraints there when we try to push the boundary above this level? So some of that information you have already seen there, that the solar PV, the onshore wind, the costs have dramatically come down, and they are projected to go down even more. But that does not mean that the overall system costs are going to reduce. If we look at solar PV, for example, it has come down by 90% from 1.5 decades back. The same thing is for onshore wind. So why do we not see that whole thing translated into the overall lower cost of the green sources of energy? Because there is a system integration component that does not very often gets talked about. So if we look at the left-hand side graph there, so the plant level costs, even though you might see that they are quite low, but the integration of those energy generated by solar PV or by the windmills has to have some level of adjustment. For example, we have to account for the intermittency. So that reflects in the profile costs, frequency balancing costs, ancillary services, grid costs, external costs, flexibility adjustments. So all of that raises up the costs. So even though we see that the generation costs are coming down, we see that the integration costs are pushing it upwards. So in several countries, for example, which are very bullish in trying to move away from fossil fuels, they seem to be ending up paying higher costs. So take the example of Germany. Germany, for example, has to pay roughly upwards of 90 euros per megawatt hour because of all of these obstacles. So in conclusion, on the topic of energy, yes, renewables are the lowest cost way to decarbonize grid. And if the grid decarbonizes, it has got a knock-on effect for the other industries which rely very heavily. We see the falling generation costs, but they do not necessarily translate to lower system-wise costs, which, for example, are paid by the end customers, by the heavy industries. So, because the costs are not going as steeply as we would like to, so that also reflects in our ability to decarbonize, because the question somebody raised there, who pays for that transformation? So that's quite a big question that we do have to answer. So if we were to look at big numbers, what does it mean in terms of investment decisions? The lowest cost in terms of percentage of abatement can come through BF optimization, because we are working with the existing infrastructure, existing technologies. If we were to start substituting fuels we can easily bring down our CO2 intensity, and by that extension require less input in terms of investment. So BF optimization, using more scrap, expansion of EF fleet. But if we were to really go for the highest absolute decarbonization that can come from those radical processes or the bolt-on technologies, for example, if we very heavily deploy CCS on our BF fleet, we can reduce CO2 intensity, as well as the hydrogen-based DRI processes. So starting from the top row all the way, the difficulty in terms of investment cost goes higher and higher and higher. So what are those levers of change that we can work on? The energy system and infrastructure development, as I said there, this is one of those biggest levers that we should be mindful of. The carbon costing is going to play quite a big role in leveling the playing field across the world. We see quite a lot of those carbon costing mechanisms started in mainly in the EU. Now we see that coming up more and more in the emerging economies like China and India. Of course, we need willing customers who are going to somehow pay for the low carbon steel. And if we can extend the life of our products, for example, reusing, repurposing and recycling steel, then we use less steel, and by that extension we use less energy and produce less CO2. So in summary, steel industry is not just a local thing, and somebody mentioned in the beginning that it's a global thing, but it still has got regional flavors. There's a growing trend we see quite frequently talked about there, that we are working on the technologies which are quite radical, dramatic, but they are not all on the very high TRL level. So we still have to iron out some of the obstacles. So the coming decades will be transformative, but we need policy and public support, and it requires concerted effort across the value chain. For example, we did talk about the value of iron making slag, that it can reduce the CO2 intensity from the cement processes. So we have to work in harmony. So we should not be, for example, working only in silos, but having kind of a very collaborative type of an approach in reducing the overall system CO2. So with that, I will end my presentation. I hope I have not exceeded those 10 minutes that were allocated. Well, thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rizwan. I mean, it's always fascinating to hear, the diagnostic that you made in terms of CO2 emissions and energy outlook for the steel industry. It was also good to see the different levels of technologies that can change this picture. All the way from carbon direct avoidance, recycling, and reduction technologies, and definitely good to hear your summary on some of those levers for change that are so much needed, and some of those who we're definitely hoping to tackle through the Industrial Decarbonization Program. So thank you so much, Dr. Rizwan. Now we're going to move ahead with Ashish Kumar. He's a steel industry specialist for the IFC. And he's going to be speaking a little bit about some of the investments that IFC and what's IFC's approach towards this multiple technology pathways within decarbonizing the steel sector. Ashish, over to you.
Very good. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Some of my information that I'll be sharing will be kind of duplication of what Dr. Rizwan just presented, but with a different flavor. So you want me to pull up my presentation, or how do you want to do that?
If it's easier, otherwise I can present it myself.
Okay, either way it's fine. Let me try it from my side. Screen share. Can you see it?
Yeah, it's loading. Yes, we can see it, Ashish.
All right. Okay. So again, thank you so much, Alfredo, for this opportunity to present IFC's point of view here. So what I'm going to talk about is totally related to steel and steel only, and from also from financial viability point of view as well. So the first is, how much of steel is being produced in the world, or how much of the capacity is present there in the world right
Actually,
now.
sorry to interrupt you, but we cannot see it in full screen mode. Just
Oh,
FYI, we see the
okay.
slide, the main slide.
Let me do that. I'm having some technical issues. Why? You know what? Let me stop sharing. Why don't you share it? Will that work?
Yes, absolutely. It should be loading in your screen right now. Let me know if that works.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Next slide, please. All right. So talking about the total capacity, the installed capacity is about 2.4 billion tons that the world can produce. That is the installed capacity. But again, I'll come down to a fact that, installed capacity cannot be your operational capacity. The best case scenario you can have is about 85% or so. It's very, very difficult to go beyond 85%. So as you can see, right now, the world is at about 76% of capacity utilization. Can't go beyond 85%. It has improved from 67% to 76%. So there is an improvement of about 9% capacity utilization here. But again, I would say here is that 85% is the kind of limit that we have to set for ourselves. There are certain countries that have exceeded it, but that is only in very rare cases that it can happen. You need to have downtime for all kinds of things in the steel industry. I have worked in steel industry for a number of years. So I have experience on both sides of the table. I've been customer of the steel industry, and I've run steel plants as well. Out of this, as Dr. Rizwan presented earlier, about 2/3 or 70% of the total steel that's produced in the world is coming from the blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace. These are highly carbon-intensive processes. About 32%. Well, it will be lower than 32% because we have other processes as well that we'll see in the following slides. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is the global steel capacity distribution, basically. As you can see, China by far has the biggest steel production facilities in the world. In fact, they produce more than half of the total steel produced in the world. They have a capacity of about 1.1, 1.2 billion tons, and they have been able to use it about 88% of that capacity. On an average, the global capacity usage is at around 67%. The capacity utilization is very low in Europe, as you can see there. It's only about 61%. The Asian countries actually do well on the capacity utilization. I think it's about 82 to 83% in India, 85 to 88% in China, and also pretty good in the Southeastern Asian countries. Next one, please. This is a map that I just wanted to share with the group here is where the steel is moving from on a global scale. Where is the steel coming from? And on top of that, what carbon footprint does it have? As you can see, most of the steel exports are happening out of China, out of Asia, basically, and most of it is out of China. I would say about 90% is out of China. That's where these exports are happening. And as you can see, the color is red here. Red means, it's very high carbon footprint. So basically, blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace. That's how the steel is produced. That's the manufacturing process that's being utilized. The biggest customer for that steel is North America, basically United States. Very little goes in Canada and Mexico. So that is you can see how high carbon footprint of the steel is that we are using right now. We'll come to other methods. We'll come to other manufacturing process and potentials in the following slides. Total global export that stands about 450 million tons, and most of it is coming from one section of the countries, basically. Next slide, please. This is the split that I was talking about, the blast furnace, electric arc furnace. Right now, this is business as usual as of today. Well, it's a little bit older number, but, still holds pretty good at this time. So the global steel production is about 1.9 billion tons. Out of that, the blast furnace contribution is about 1.3 to 1.4 billion tons. So you can see, that's 71% of the total steel produced coming from the blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace. Then we have electric arc furnace, about 400 odd million tons, and then small part is DRI. This is business as usual as of today. What we are envisaging in year 2050 is a totally different scenario. And that could happen because of the policies that we are going to talk about, the issues. If we could address those issues, we could get to this point, which is you will reduce your blast furnace, your high carbon footprint steel, to only 470 million tons. Now the question may be, why can't you reduce it altogether? You can't reduce it altogether. There are certain types of steel that needs certain types of steel requirements that need blast furnace steel only, and that's because, it could be more technical if I go into the details of that, but there are other research that's going on just to see how we can effectively manage our scrap electric arc furnace steel to have the same type of properties, same type of qualities. You can see your scrap electric arc furnace production goes up by more than twice in this period, but there is a caveat here. The caveat is there is not enough scrap available in the world. Right now, what the estimation is about 800 million tons to 900 million tons is this availability of the scrap. So here the assumption is the availability of the scrap will go up, and we will be able to generate more of steel coming out of this process, which has a very low carbon footprint. It could, if the grid, again, it depends on the grid, which grid the electric power is coming from. If it is coming from a greener grid, in certain countries, the grid is pretty green. If I give you an example, a country in specific, Brazil has pretty green grid to an extent of 85% renewable energy. So same goes for Argentina, So for that, you have pretty green energy coming in here. You could utilize that. You could drop down your carbon footprint further below 0.5 tons per ton of the steel produced. So again, now if you go down in this table, you can see what the China's contribution is. Right now, about 927 million tons of that is the blast furnace related. We expect it to drop down to about 150 million tons. That's a dramatic reduction in the blast furnace capacity. Whereas on the other hand, if you look at India, right now the blast furnace capacity is about 61 million tons. It's going to go up to about 247 million tons. In fact, India will have more than half of the total blast furnace capacity in year 2050. So that's something, and that's the reason being India is growing dramatically. It's growing very fast, so it needs steel. The easiest way to get steel is India has a lot of good coal reserves and a lot of good iron ore reserves, very rich. So they could utilize both of these reserves, and they don't have to import, expensive petroleum products from other countries. So that's why they're going to they're doubling down on that on the blast furnace. Next slide, please. These are the different routes that we are looking at this time. You have business as usual, your blast furnace, a lot of CO2 emissions here. Next one is the carbon capture. Carbon capture actually helps a lot with the carbon footprint control, but there is a cost associated with that. Then next one is your DRI. DRI is direct reduced iron. Basically, that's how you say that. And you basically use again iron ore in that process, so virgin iron with electric arc furnace. Compared to business as usual, your carbon content goes down by about 40% on this process. And the next one is DRI EAF with hydrogen in it. This process has not been verified yet. There are a lot of efforts that are going into that. Hydrogen is a different type of reaction with iron ore. That's how it reduces iron ore to iron. That is a totally different reaction that goes on there. And there is a big cost of hydrogen on top of that. Efforts are still going on. Hopefully we can get a good solution sooner. Next slide, please. Next one. All right. So do we have a pathway to net zero? We do have a pathway. And do we have certain conditions that this pathway can be achieved? Yes, there are certain conditions. So circular economy, which is your scrap-based economy, steel-making economy, is going to play a very key role in decarbonization of the steel. As I showed you earlier, most of the blast furnace related steel is going to come from your electric arc furnace, which is your circular economy right there. But as you can see, even if you were to use your iron ore based industry, there are ways where you can get to this point. So there are different buckets out there. So we'll talk about these buckets in detail in next slides. Next slide, please. I think I'm already running late on my presentation, so I'll go faster, quicker now. So this is what it shows, your carbon footprint, your scrap electric arc furnace, very low. You go to your blast furnace, electric arc furnace, and then it kind of jumps up dramatically. And right in the middle of this, as you see, DRI, EAF, steel producing route. Next slide, please. I wanted to talk about this slide for sure. So this is business as usual. I've taken a snap in time. Your hot rolled coil is at $521 per ton. Okay. Now, if you decide to go for carbon capture, you have to add $176 per ton to this cost. So that's going to bump it up to $697 per ton. Or if you go to a different route, which is your DRI electric arc furnace with natural gas, not with coal. Your coal footprints are going to be higher than your blast furnace basic oxygen furnace coal carbon footprint. So if you go to this route, you have to add $170 per ton to get your steel from this process. If you were to go to totally green steel, which is DRI electric arc furnace, you have to add as much as the cost of steel itself to so your cost basically doubles up at this time. Right now, the cost of hydrogen is about $8 per kilogram, which is very high. Unless it goes down to below $2 per kilogram, it will not be financially viable. It is very expensive steel. And there may not be many buyers for this type of a steel. And your electric arc furnace, you have a reasonable amount of good steel here, good carbon, lower carbon, and the rate is, of course, is going to be higher than blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace. But even in this, this $668 per ton that I show here, that can be further reduced by controlling your processes. How do you lay out your plant? Those kind of things. You can save about 10 to 15% of your energy cost right there. Next slide, please. So what are the barriers for low carbon transition? Your profit margin gets squeezed, because the cost goes up as soon as you start controlling your carbon. Be it your even if you replace coal with natural gas, your cost goes up. Your carbon capture, your cost goes up. Your hydrogen cost definitely goes up. Number two, there is significant investment associated with this. That brings in some amount of risk to the industries. That's another issue there. We talk about the overcapacity of the steel in the world. Is there any overcapacity? If you look at 10% of your existing capacity is ready to retire at this point, okay, and your operational capacity is about 2.1 billion tons. So you take 10% out, you're right there where your demand is at this time. So you're actually sitting in a very very risky situation. And the demand goes down, you don't have enough capacity there to cater to it. So, all right, let's move on to next one. I mean, I have a few more things that I can talk about, but looks like I'm already running late on this. Barriers, your financing, the demand, the premium steel demand, capabilities, which is the technology, availability of the technology that's not available. We talk about the hydrogen-based. We don't have that technology yet. It's being worked on. The ecosystem, the supply chain and those kind of things, we don't have that. The climate policies, they have not been defined in different parts of the world. Only a selected few areas are where the climate policies and regulations have been defined. And the technology, there are a number of other technologies that are being worked on. MOE, which is molten oxide electrolysis process, it has been worked on, but it's not a proven technology yet. There are some other technologies that are being worked on. Next slide, please. These are the potential tools. I'll go through this slide rather quickly. These are the potential tools. Right now, we are sitting here. We need to be here. As I said earlier, you cannot basically take the whole carbon out of the process. There will be some carbon left out there. But how do you get to this point? Is adoption of low emission technologies. That's number one. That's the biggest pie here. And the circular economy is another big thing that you can do. Your energy efficiency in the system, your yield improvement. So yield improvement, energy efficiency, they can be clubbed together, and together they can make a big chunk of carbon footprint savings here. Next slide, please. What does IFC do basically to support this? So we have been in this business supporting steel industry for 25 years, already committed about $2.5 billion, 15 plus countries, 25 plus projects globally. We have industry expertise in-house, not only in the steel, but also associated areas. We have very good hydrogen team in our group. We are sustainability leaders, basically. We look at your environment, ENS, very closely, and also corporate governance very closely. Most of our work is basically happening in Eastern Europe. That's where we have finance so far. We are diversifying that. This is South Asia, and this will be Africa. So right now, our focus is Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. These are some of the customers that we have helped. Next slide. So how do we help our clients? How do we help our customers, basically? So for the mature projects, there are a number of ways we help them. There are direct debt loans available there. We have green bonds that we can help them with. We have blended financing that we can help them with. We have equity investment also in those companies that we can help them with. So these are for the mature ones. The upstream ones, we can help them in a number of ways. The project-specific support, we can co-invest in the project development, and we can also create a sector-level ecosystem. That's how we can help them. We also have the advisory services where we can provide decarbonization strategy development with the companies, with the countries, and also we can help them with the feasibility studies. Next slide. These are the technical pillars of industrial decarbonization. I've talked about it. These are in a little bit more detail. I think we will go through it real quick. What are the near-term potential we have for near to midterm, depending on redeployment of the assets, and then mid to long term and long term. So that's how we have categorized all these options. Next slide. I mean, it's too technical, so I don't want to go through that all over again. So this is the house map that we have, our global industrial decarbonization approach. This is how we work. Accelerate the implementation, unlock with concessional financing, and catalyze innovation through upstream and venture capital initiatives. And there is some more details in there. So that was the last slide. I'm sorry I took a bit longer than time allotted to me. So I will stop here.
So thank you so much, Ashish. I think it's extremely valuable. Also, your presentation, to hear IFC take on removing or addressing the barriers on different technologies that are out there to decarbonize the steel sector. I mean, we've heard all the way from energy efficiency, circular economy, but also low emission technologies, and how at the end that near to mid or to long term sort of approach that it's taken by the IFC. So thank you so much, Ashish, for that. I think in the sake of time, we're going to skip this Q&A and we're going to go straight to our final speaker so that then we can leave a longer space for Q&A. And with that in mind, I would like to ask Darshak again, who you've already met. He's Senior Carbon Capture and Utilization Specialist for the Asian Development Bank. He's going to introduce us or go a little bit into more detail around the GHG methodologies that the ADB use, particularly for the steel sector in this particular occasion. So Darshak, over to you.
Thank you. Let me just share my slides. Please let me know once you see that. Share, and here I go.
We can see them.
Okay, I'll put it in full scale mode. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
We can see them.
Okay. So thank you so much for this. I'm the only honored person who is making two presentations. So I have liberty to say that some of the slides that I'll be having in the later half are same as what I've given it in cement presentation. So it will not be as long as it was there. But let's begin. I mean, some of the things are already said, but let's just recap a few things. I mean, just like in cement, the whole process begins with raw material extraction in case of cement industry. Then, in case of steel industry, then we have energy production, primary process of coke making, sintering, etc. Then secondary processes will be like BOF, EAF, and secondary metallurgy contribution to direct and indirect emissions. Then rolling and treatment, which will be hot rolling, cold rolling, etc. And then finally transportation and distribution. These are all the processes through which the raw material to final steel making and final steel product goes into. So let us try to go to the next step as to what happens. Now, when it goes to steel making, it might be a good idea to, just a second, I'll try to remove this if possible. You still see this? Okay. Okay, fine. So now, these, as has been said by the previous speakers, that BF and BOF pathway is one of the important things. What is the total emission that is happening in this case? So this emission is coming out of coke smoking, sintering, blast furnace, BOF process, and finally the output and electricity consumption. So the biggest chunk out of this 2200 kg CO2 that is happening per ton of cement, about 1500 tons kg of CO2 per ton of hot metal is actually coming from blast furnace. So that is where the major steel making process, blast furnace, is working on this. Let's go to the next. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, just a second. Sorry, there's something funny happening over here, and okay. Okay. Next is again the EF scrap and EF DRI processes. So there are two these processes. One is this. This is the scrap route, whereas you have a scrap available to you directly. It goes into AF, and then you get this get the steel. Other processes, you get to DRI, get the iron fines, then you take it to electric arc furnace, and then you have the final product. The third is you use coal, get the use the coal and get the iron that is needed to be fed to electric arc furnace, and with electricity, then you have the final number over here. So, having understood this broad, let me just try to summarize as to what it looks like for different iron making processes. These are broad numbers and need not go in nitty-gritty of it, but just based on the earlier slides, GHG emission in BF-BOF's route is about 2.2 tons of CO2. Then in DRI EAF coal-based route, you will have 1.9 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced. When we go to natural gas route, it will be 1.4 ton of CO2 almost. And then finally, when you reach to say scrap-based steel making, then you have an output of 842. And based on certain market share of all these processes, or based on the certain numbers, is that we are having 70% of steel that is coming off BF-BOF route, then 5% from DRI route, and scrap comes by 24%. These are the numbers which have been taken from certain literature, and which is link is given over here. The idea now is that the current baseline scenario of 71, 24, and 5%, which is giving us an weighted average emission of per ton of steel produced of 1.8 ton of CO2 per ton of steel produced. If we change this technology mix to say in medium terms, medium terms will be a bit relative term in terms of steel industry, because each blast furnace and major equipment, they have lifespan of more than 15, 20, 40 years almost. So in the medium term, if we can, when the end of lifetime comes up, if we can shift this process to say 51% from 70 BF from 51% to 71% to 51%. Scrap will be say remaining same around 24% because of probably availability of scrap, and DRI-EAF route increases from 5% to 25%. Then we will be able to reduce from 1857 tons of CO2 per ton of CO2 to 1713. If we go to the next step, it will and alter this mixture further, we can get to about 1.5 tons of CO2. In the process, we will be increasing a bit of electricity consumption, but that is good enough for us because it is going to help us into the overall emission reduction, and probably electricity grid, as we say it later, is going to be greener. Now, when we want to do these technology shifts, what are our considerations? First is vintage of the technologies employed in the country. Say, what is the remaining life? Because that is something which will determine the economics of it. Then availability of clean fuel. One would really like to go for natural gas, but with cost and availability of natural gas will be a big challenge. So that is one of the important consideration also when you go for pure economics. So unless your carbon prices are right, probably you may or may not be able to afford a cleaner fuel. Let's face that. Then price of substitution fuel, again, what I've said, I mean, biomass over a period of time, if the demand increases, the experience has shown that biomass, although it is carbon neutral, when it is known that biomass is valuable resource, its price also goes up. So you need to know not only today's price, but in the altered scenario, what is going to be the price. Then development stage of economy. Now, this is an important thing. Say, when the economies are at a lower stage of development, say, let me put a little bit in a way, a country which has already started its liberalization and progress, say 30 years ago, will have some equipment, some vehicle which are available for recycling today, compared to another country which is just starting its journey. So in a developing economy, the scrap availability is going to be fairly limited. And in that sense, we cannot, although if you recall the previous slide, the limiting factor in increasing the scrap-based thing was because the availability of scrap. So availability of scrap needs to be seen. Now, I would like to give an example of the policy, how it can affect. Say, in India recently, government has introduced recycling of vehicle and retirement of vehicle scheme now. What it is doing, trying to do is very old, older vehicles than 15 years are supposed to be recycled or supposed to be phased out in the economy. What are the implications of that? The fuel efficiency of vehicles which are newer compared to 15-year-old will be better. So the emission is certainly going to reduce. And that is the big advantage. Second is there is greater employment generation. And third is these steel will be then available for say recycling and emission reduction will also be reducing further. So these are some of the things that scrap increase policy level decisions, how it can affect things. So what are the decarbonization approaches? These are well known and have already been discussed. Energy efficiency, renewable energy, recycling of steel, and then of course the temperature and pressure recovery. Finally, of course, carbon capture and utilization and storage. Now let us try to see as to how different companies across the world are perceiving this. So this is example from the roadmap or how the whole steel has been perceived by JFE Steel in Japan. What they are trying to see is that, okay, they will be using a lot of renewable energy. They will be using hydrogen. Again, they will be going for carbon recycling. Means they will be using, say, methane as a fuel, natural gas as fuel. CO2 will be emitted. That will be blended with green hydrogen and again recycled over here. So it's a circular route in which they will be going, and except for green hydrogen, it can go on. The other route, of course, the experts will really say is instead of going for hydrogen, one can also go for CO, shift by putting up injection on CO2 and hydrogen and creating CO plus H2, and that can also be fed. That's another route, but more or less the concept remains the same. Now, the other company is, of course, POSCO, which is trying to shift to hydrogen-based steel making. It is investigating production of hydrogen gas through nuclear reactor with focus on newer and compact modular design. ArcelorMittal has got its own strategy, which is saying DRI and electric arc furnaces. So they are trying to move away from coal to electricity, natural gas, and hydrogen readiness. Waste wood in waste wood also used. Say biomass has been very much a good pathway that has been seen. Then waste gas from blast furnace has been used to make ethanol. So that's a plant, LanzaTech technology they have used, tried to make this. And they have been able to save something like 225 tons of CO2 and so on and forth. One more example we are taking again from, say, JFE. Now, steel making is a very specific process. There are certain expertise which lies with the metallurgical engineer and people in steel industry. So they cannot be expected to run a chemical plant. This is an example of CCU project. So what the approach that has been taken is that they have captured CO2 and they are trying to make it into methanol, but the model is they are shifting it to, say, Mitsubishi gas chemical, which is having making methanol and other things that is its own core production process. Then methanol is a very strong basis for chemical engineers. From there, a lot of other products can be made. So then this methanol is passed on to the chemical group, which is going to make it in properly in production. So such kind of permutation and combination and business models can be thought of. Hydrogen, as we have seen in earlier slide, has got a number of ways of doing it. Today, SMR-based hydrogen making will be giving us a 12 kg CO2 per kg of hydrogen made. Okay. Then there is newer technology of methane pyrolysis, which is coming up, which is going to give you 3 to 4 kg of CO2 per kg of hydrogen produced. Of course, the economics of this will be based upon availability of natural gas or biogas or in the region where you are applying. Say compared to US, cost of hydrogen will have a cost of natural gas. The raw material coming in this case will be very different. The advantage of methane pyrolysis is it will eliminate your whole carbon capture process, which is a very interesting thing to do. Grid-based electrolysis, in this case, 55 kg CO2 and per kg of CO2, you will have, if the grid is not so clean, you will have 55 kg of CO2 per kg of hydrogen. Better grid will give you, say, 27, and green hydrogen can be produced by steel also. So these are the emission. So hydrogen production itself is having so many options. Of course, as indicated earlier also, these are at different levels. Say methane pyrolysis might be still at TRL level of 6 or 7 or 8 probably maximum, but it has some time to go. But when you are thinking of, say, IFC like organization or development institutes like for that matter, they will be looking for newer technologies, and this is a small snapshot of that. Now, one of the other things that one must also see is that when we are, say, converting to electricity, we are moving from, then also we may also want to see that how the grid emission factor itself is moving. This is an example from India. In 1920 or so, the actual emission factor was about 0.71. Over a period of time, by 2030-31, it is likely to drop to 0.43. So even if you only go for electrification process, you are likely to have quite an interesting emission reduction over the next period of time. So your incremental emission reduction targets may be met automatically. Okay. Now, in case of CCUS, what are the different assumptions you may want to make? Is what is the maturity of capture technology, which is very much evolving, and faster it is coming. Carbon market development will be important, because your carbon market, if it is available at, say, giving you price of $30 to $40 or $20, then today's price, when you are going to have capture cost of $60, $70, it may not be good. But say 2, 5 years, 7 years down the line, maybe the carbon prices will go up, and that time these same technologies might be useful. Storage facility should be available somewhere. CO2 transport infrastructure is needed. Cost effectiveness of CO2 derived product. That is also very important, actually, because the CO2 derived product is actually costing, in case of CCUS, is 3 to 4 times compared to, say, normal product which is available for fuel derived products. So unless you have somebody really ready to pay that kind of price, it may not be very much possible. Availability of manpower is one more thing which may hamper things. Now, these are the slides which are already displayed earlier, so I'll just skip them through. And yeah, we'll come to some of the case studies as we had seen in cement sector. Now, this is a process wherein, this is a project wherein blast furnace gas was used and fed into 300 megawatt combined cycle power plant in Anshan Iron and Steel Company. Methodology used was ACM 004. Additionality was proven through investment analysis, which is that internal IRR of 13% that was required was not met. So that is how it was supposed to be there. Baseline was import of electricity from grid, which was 1.07 compared to, say, almost zero emission factor over here. And emission reduction was almost 1.7 million tons. And monitoring, of course, electricity generation from power was there. Biomass-based power generation, this was one of the other tools that we had seen. It is in, say, Rukman is still somewhere. And in India, project description was 10 megawatt rice-based power plant, which was put up. Methodology used, MS1D. Baseline at that point of time was 0.96 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour, which was probably available from grid at that point of time. In this case, special care needs to be taken to ensure that sustainability of biomass, which is a point which has been already discussed by the previous speaker, which is actually a very important factor when it comes to the projects of, especially with biomass. This kind of project had reduced emission by about 36,000 tons of CO2. Electricity generation, additional fuel, etc., are the fuel thing. Now, why we have repeatedly said that recycling of steel is important, and why it is important is something that can be seen over here. Now, when you go to how you, there is a certain amount which is baseline CO2 emission, which will be calculated over here, wherein quantity of metal that has been used, then and then what is the specific CO2 emission, which is given in table 4 below. So this is the baseline. The baseline taken is actually very, very conservative. In case of steel, 1.27 tons is really very conservative baseline, but that has been taken as a baseline. And the actual recycled steel will, when you do the recycling, the project emission will come out of the emission factor of the electricity that has been used in recycling and processing the steel, and of course the fuel that has been used. And sorry, I would have loved to have one other slide which would have given you more basic information as to the emission reduction would be baseline emission, what has been arrived in this slide, minus the emission reduction in project's emission. So this is how, these are the examples when you are free to access them. What are the different data that are used for understanding the emission, these kind of projects. So raw material extraction, direct emission of methane from coal mining, how to go about it. That is for that you will have to get the emission factor, the Department of Energy for energy management and procurement, etc. Energy production, of course, it will be energy production related data will have to be calculated, including say PPA or what is the source of electricity. If it is captive consumption, then one will have to go to get the fuel used and its emission factor. Now, overall, the lessons for the countries is to create a robust database on current technologies and their emissions, along with the vintages of the plant. That is important for us to decide as to what is the point of inflection when you can retire the old plants earlier or old technologies earlier and lead to the emission reduction. Then explore what are the best available technologies. Feel free to borrow generously from anybody who is having some good example and try to implement and use it rather than reinventing the wheel. Invest in manpower and laboratories and power plants, pilot plants. Pilot plants is one of the most important things that is going to be used, because that will give very valuable experience to the people and confidence to them to implement a good technology. And then one has to really go for a robust regulation network so that people are encouraged to go forward with the newer technology. I think that is all I have. Of course, this is an earlier slide on other various carbon markets and what methodologies we can use. Thank you. Thank you so much. And this is the ADB's own technical guidance note on greenhouse emission projects to be financed by ADB. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darshak, for that detailed explanation. Definitely very interested to see what's the Asian Development Bank's take on GHG accounting, both baseline and other types of scenarios from the steel industry as well, not just the cement one. And I think it's always good to see like some of those examples that you were showing at the end of some technologies and projects that the ADB was betting on and was investing on, the blast furnace gas combined cycle power project, the biomass-based power generation project, and obviously always the part in recycling of steel. So it's always good to illustrate with those examples. So definitely looking forward to hearing a bit more. But I am aware that we're running out of time. I want to give at least 10 minutes for the Q&A for these three very interesting discussions we've had. So over to you, Janak.
Yeah, thank you, Alfredo, and thank you to our presenters. It's really a resource-packed session, and then I think this will be kind of the great opportunity in terms of understanding the overall concepts in the technologies, and the approaches for decarbonizing the cement and steel sectors. And I think I really encourage to have like this, have a good peer network to share exchanges and understand further, going into deep dive, learning the tools and whatever approach is being presented. I just have a quick reflections. If we do not have any questions on the from the participant side, so I just want to take this opportunity. Question to Dr. Janjua. Any reflections on? I understand that we have CCDR, the climate, the country climate diagnostic reports for example, India and South Africa. How do we see the pathways? They have in the report align with the pathways you have described in terms of benchmarks, like with the new technologies you see that would be required for decarbonization, whether they are aligned or they are completely disconnected, and any advice from your end?
I must admit that I have not come across the report, so any information that I'm going to share here will be quite theoretical. We developed the CO2 accounting methodology, which was translated into ISO standards, which are being revised, and then there are a number of agencies now which are working on trying to harmonize the accounting methodologies, because very often you come across that kind of a thing there, that if you use a certain methodology, it gives you a different number. So people are trying to push or encourage that we have got one unique methodology which can give you the answer that is translatable, or even if you are using all sorts of different methodologies, can give you a number that makes sense. When it comes to the different pathways, how do they give you those numbers? They are very subjective right now, because quite a number of those approaches that we are working on. Take the example of carbon capture. Carbon capture has got an energy penalty, and then when it comes to storage, it has to be super clean for the process reasons. Depending on where you are in the world, it will have different prices. So you see quite a big range in terms of how you can deploy them. So these are very, very subjective, and then depending on the local circumstances, what sort of energy mix you have, the grid is decarbonizing at different pace around the world. So anything that you come across, you have to very subjectively look at the number, how it was calculated. So it's very difficult to give a very transparent number there that can be easily replicated anywhere in the world. So there are nuances.
Thanks, Dr. Janjua. And I think also you have brought the important aspects of, sometimes it's like a misconception, in the market, that the levelized cost of electricity production from solar and wind is really competitive, but without taking into account the grid integration cost. Also, looking at the steel sector, I think the primary focus is some intervention on replacing blast oxygen furnace route through electric arc furnace, and for that prerequisite is it depends on the grid emission intensity, right? So, but I think there are a number of kind of the solutions being in place, like how to bring down this grid integration cost because of this intermittency. But when you talk about renewable, it's not only solar and wind, but it always has to be complemented through the storage, right? So where the countries are, resources like with hydro, the storage, hydropower storage always helps to make the grid stable, and you can help evacuating more and more grid, more renewables like intermittent renewables in a more stable manner, and also the introduction of battery energy storage. But the message is, I think this has to go hand in hand, not look at the silo, but at the these more sector level. Otherwise, it's impossible to align with the decarbonization pathways, particularly for the steel sector. If the 70% of the emissions we are talking about related to blast furnace. So my question to IFC is, so you mentioned, Assis, that IFC has been helping clients over 25 years. But one can see still we are not at the encouraging kind of the point where still things have not happened as as it has to. But without IFC interventions, what would have happened, right? So maybe that perspective also you could bring, right? Otherwise, it could be a kind of the impression that basically, throughout the involvement of IC over 25 years, but basically, the value propositions in terms of, changing the kind of the, pathway and supporting the clients to the pathways that otherwise they would have been completely, locked in. And also, it will be helpful for our participants to understand like what makes the still decarbonization investment bankable from today's perspective. Like, is there any specific metrics from the modeling, any IRR, threshold, abatement cost, payback period, etc., that determines whether IFC can structure a deal around, right? And also particularly for Group B countries in Asia, right? So the presentation has made it clear that most of this, steel production is like the coal-based, deeply embedded in the industrial structure. And for these countries, what is the realistic entry point for decarbonization that EMDBs can actually finance in near term? Thanks.
So you're looking for a response from us? We have been
from Ashish.
Yeah, so we have been trying for over last. I joined IFC about less than 2 years ago, right? And prior to that, we have been working on this decarbonization drive. We have come up we pretty close to coming up with a tool for the carbon contained carbon. Uh, how much of carbon is involved in this whole process. So we are partnering with a couple of companies outside to come up with that tool. Another cement tool that Claudine talked about earlier. Similarly, we're going to have a steel tool that we are going to talk about in our next meeting. So that's number one. Number two is we are redefining as to how we are financing and encouraging a greener steel production. I wouldn't say green because there is no green steel available in the world right now. It is the greener steel that's available. So we are encouraging that, and part of that is we invested money in new startups that have some very good ideas, and we continue to do that to allow them to come up with a new technology. Right now, as Janak, you can see that there are ways, but those ways are way too expensive. You cannot move altogether to the scrap-based steel production because there's not enough scrap available. That definitely will bring down the carbon content. Uh, as far as the carbon capture is concerned, there is a cost associated with that. So we are working with the companies, with the governments, to come up with the regulations for that. Like, CBAM happens to be one of them, that IFC partnered with basically. And we are working with all the countries and all the companies in the world to promote them to take the lower carbon route, for steel production. And part of that is, the tools that I showed in my presentation. That's what we are focusing on. There are 5 different ways we can save carbon, we can save energy, and that's what we are focusing on. So I hope that answers your question, Janak.
And maybe, Janek, if I can add, thank you, Ashish, just to add one more point. I think the way from IFC side, the way we approach it, right? There is already available technology, right, that has been proven. So we try to help companies adopt those technologies, through our financing. And as Ashish was saying, I think these problems are beyond also the industry, where they also need to share some of the infrastructure, and there has to be the creation of an ecosystem, right, that enables investments that require more capex and may not be commercially viable. So we're also working with different stakeholders, including donors, on how to create an ecosystem, that replicates a bit of what's happening in other developed countries, right? How can we get incentives in place? How can we get grant money and other types of subsidized funding that we can close and blended finance, right, to close the commercial viability? But really, we try to work with our clients in implementing the technologies that are currently available to decrease as much as possible their emissions, so that then what's remaining, as Ashish and the other speakers were highlighting, right, there's always going to be a remaining amount that cannot disappear, right, from the process, and you would need to do CCUS. And so how can we reduce that amount of emissions as much as possible with the available technology, so that then it becomes a lower amount, right, to be captured and hopefully utilized. And as Ashish was saying, aside from investing and contributing to some of these new technologies being developed, we also want to partner with companies in piloting some of these technologies, right, on doing smaller pilots to test drive these technologies on the plant, to demonstrate, right, that they're scalable and be able to then, help scale across different projects. So that's the approach that we're looking.
Claudine?
In fact, Janak, we are going to an extent that, even if there is a startup that has a very good potential idea, we try to get ourselves involved with that. We try to promote them, we try to give them grant and those kind of things, however we can help them. So decarbonization is a big thing on our mind. Any project that we do, first thing we look at, hey, what's the carbon footprint here? So
maybe if
Claudine,
I can, yes, if I can just add to that, I think being part of the larger World Bank group, one of the key priorities is scaling solutions. So we're looking at how we can implement solutions that, that can be scaled at country level. And having, being part of the World Bank helps us not just to operate or to assist at a company level, but if we see a problem at a company level, for cement, for example, there's a need for refuse-derived fuel for use of, but that ecosystem, as Margarita has indicated, is not there. There isn't that supply, that continuous supply. There isn't, proper collection. There isn't proper processing. So, we can link both the companies together with the policymakers, together with, the right governmental, stakeholders to try and, get that in place to support such initiatives. So these are the larger level or higher level, or the high level impact we want to make as an organization.
Yeah, thank you, Claudine. Definitely, it's very helpful. I think hope it's very helpful to the clients. And also one of the aspects that IFC and as part of the World Bank Group, they also always make effort in terms of designing the right special purpose vehicles as needed, right? In terms of blended finance, bringing carbon market, in terms of tapping opportunities where you complement consistent finance, right? So there are different ways of how you bring the finance depending on where we are with the technologies, from low hanging to the high marginal abatement cost technologies, etc. So I stop here for Q&A, and again I thanks to all of the presenters, and I just see this as a very good starting point, and hope this really helps the participants, in terms of going forward on GHG modeling, having good establishing good network with all the presenters and also among the participants. Alfredo.
Thank you very much, Janak, and thank you again. I won't take too much longer. I know we're over time, so thank you very much to each one of our speakers of today's session, but also of the first session. We've had 6 hours of deep conversations from overall methodologies on GHG accounting, on industrial decarbonization, but we also dove deeper into chemical, cement, and steel. So I think it's been fascinating. We had over 20 speakers, if I'm not mistaken. So big thanks to all of you who made this this virtual clinic possible. Big thank to you, Janak, as well, for moderating this Q&A session, and for also for the CIF Secretariat, for my colleagues that made, all the way from comms, operations, governance, and obviously Maru, who's also heavily involved in this, and Ziza. So big thanks to everyone that made this possible. Hopefully we were able to meet everyone's expectations. We had a big participation from Group B countries, also from Group A countries from our Industrial Decarbonization Program. So with that in mind, we will be sharing the recordings and the presentations with participants. So do expect them in your email sometime soon. Again, big thanks to everyone here present and everyone who made it possible. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you in the near future.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.